some provocations for you all about how to construct an Ames page, and look forward. Frankly, I would love to know what people think about this. So please do jump in at any point during this discussion. I think my point that I'm going to try to make here is pretty simple and straightforward. So there'll be plenty of space, I think, for discussion. If people want to raise their hands, I'll try to keep an eye on the chats. This is taken from a talk that I sometimes give to mostly doctors, but it doesn't just apply to doctors. I think it applies to physician scientists, but also a lot of times researchers who work in the natural sciences, who studied sort of like public health and sort of more sort of quantitative type sciences before they start their careers. But I would say that probably one of the things that physician scientists receive very little of is training in writing. But then you find out that you have to write a lot, and you have to write well to succeed. You write grant applications, that's how you get funding. You write papers, that's how you get the things that you discover out there into the discourse. And you also, read, and I think that's how we, in general, have conducted science. That's changed, obviously. A lot of stuff now happens on Twitter and on other things. There's medRxiv, where a lot of people post things, I think, that are sort of not fully completed science, but nevertheless, people want to get it out there. And so things are changing a little bit, but at the end of the day, you do have to write in one way, shape, or form, and write rigorously and compellingly to succeed. Yet our training generally emphasizes this element sort of relatively lightly. So next slide. So I want to start with a lot of times sort of the purpose of what we're doing when we're writing a grant. And there is a lot of advice about sort of the construction of the writing itself, but I want to take a step back and ask sort of what's our purpose, to try to give it some context when we're writing a specific Ames page for a grant or a paper. Many of you may have heard this kind of thing before, but this is the argument that I'm trying to make here. You can go to the next slide, Manny. So the argument that I'm making is that what you're doing is making an argument, and in the scientific work that you do. So you can see science perhaps sort of as a conversation, right? Like lots of different people will be thinking about similar things and publishing similar things, not completely the same, but similar. And in particular, in a consortia like this consortium, there is a lot of folks thinking about very similar things. How do you get hypertension screening more widely used? How do you capture information about the barriers? And we will be talking about these things, but also writing about them. And the writing can be seen as, in some ways, a formalized conversation. It's a formal way of making arguments, and your paper or your grant is a way of making an argument or a claim about. So all these claims that we make share things with other forms of public discourse, like journalism and literature, etc. But it's different fundamentally, because in scientific discourse, claims sort of have to be supported by a scientific method, right? So you can't just sort of say you can have an argument that's just your opinion, but not a scientific argument, right? In the scientific literature. So I would encourage you all to conceive of grant applications or publications as an argument in a conversation. And I use the word argument in part to provoke people to be to take an attitude of dissatisfaction or with what is already being said. And I'll get into that in a minute. But Manny, maybe you can do the next slide. But before we get to what you might want to say in that argument, I think it's obviously important to listen, right? And to listen carefully. And when I say listen, I mean sort of reading the literature and going to conferences and or like just listening to other people who are in this conversation talk about it. And so when you make sort of a claim in a scientific conversation, it's important to recognize for the most part, you're not the first person to come to that conversation. Sometimes, you are, and you can be like, it's a conversation that hasn't been had before. But generally, it's a conversation that's been going on for a long time, maybe years, maybe decades, or maybe even centuries. And it's important to realize what's been said as a part of that conversation. So if we think about something like how do we integrate hypertension screening into HIV programs. So there is a very well-established and long conversation in health systems research about vertical programming and horizontalization of vertical programming, and what it means for health systems. When do you want to think, how do you overcome these things? There's a lot of literature about TB HIV integration, right, which is not hypertension, but is similar. There's stuff about reproductive health. There's stuff about maternal child health and HIV programs, and so there is a lot of conversations about the things that this consortium wants to speak to. It's not exactly the same, but they're related. Rafat Atun, who has written a lot about health systems, and I just came across a paper of his recently called "When Are Vertical Health Systems Necessary?" or "When Are Vertical Health Systems Beneficial?" or something like that. But I think these are the kinds of conversations that inform the present one, even if they're slightly different. Okay. Next slide. So once you have an understanding of like what the claims have been in the conversation that you're a part of, then I think you begin sort of an aims page in my mind with a problem statement. And I think you've probably heard this before. A lot of people will have said this. It always starts with a problem statement. Now there are critiques of starting with a problem statement, but let's just take this as one method. And in implementation science, in some ways, the problem statement is like ready-made for you because the whole field is a problem statement. It's like there's stuff that we know which is helpful and will improve longevity, quality of life, etc. That's not being used. And in some ways, that problem statement is sort of ready-made for you, but I think it's important to embed it within a particular problem, and then also fill in the blanks about why this problem exists, where it does. And I think that, like, in terms of framing this as an argument, the problem statement oftentimes can and should point out a problem with what has been said in the discourse about a particular topic. And I'll try to make this concrete next when we go to some examples. But next slide, maybe. Part of making an argument, and this is related to the idea that you're a part of a discourse, is that in implementation science, a lot has been said about theories and frameworks to help you understand what your problem formulation is. Because again, as you said, as we've talked about earlier, the problem that you're confronting probably isn't something that nobody has talked about before. The solutions that you're thinking of are probably also related to things that other people have said, right? And so by consulting sort of theories and frameworks, not just in implementation science, but more broadly, like sort of allows you to stand on the shoulders of giants. Like, in other words, you don't have to take responsibility for understanding this kind of problem all by yourself, because other people have had experiences, insights about this before, and drawing from those broadly will allow you to sort of get to the next level without having to climb the whole way yourself. I'm gonna stop for a second before talking about the logic model of the problem and the logic model of the solution, which comes a little. It's a language that comes from intervention mapping, which is a method. But like, let me just take the temperature of the group. I see people have their cameras off. Obviously, in many places, bandwidth is an issue. What does this land for people? And can somebody bring up like sort of a scientific problem that they're working with, and we can just workshop it for just a minute. Or if you have a particular question about anything that's been said, please do raise your hand. On the other hand, if not, no pressure either. Vincent, how are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine. How are you? Yeah, well, about a problem, I don't know if this is appropriate, but we have good medication for hypertension, to control hypertension in primary health care. But, and medications are free for the most part in my country. But there is a lot of patients, quite a sizable percentage in attending primary healthcare facilities who are not controlled, whose hypertension is not controlled. I don't know whether this fits into what you are asking us to pose to you.
Yeah, no, I think it very much is. So let's take a little bit of what we've done here, and try to workshop that a little bit. So, Vincent, where tell me where you're based.
I'm in the beautiful country of Botswana.
Great. It's a place that I've not had the pleasure of visiting before, but you said a couple of things that are interesting. Okay, so you said they're free, right? So
Yeah.
that means that the problem isn't that people can't pay for them.
Yes.
Right, so that you've already eliminated part of the you've started to sharpen up the diagnosis. Now, say more about why you think that okay, so they're free, but people aren't like getting them or using them. So is it if you want to just break this up from a sort of organizations and systems, healthcare worker and patient levels, like where do you think at least you might locate some of the problems? Is it that the pharmacy supply chain is weak and therefore the drugs are not in stock? Is it that the healthcare workers don't really know about how to prescribe it or don't know how to diagnose it? Or is it like patients have it but they don't think it's important because there's no symptoms and so they don't take it, right? So like where would you go with that, just to sharpen up the what you think is going on a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's a problem that is located at different levels. I mean, from the recent COVID pandemic, the finances that were diverted to COVID, the confinement that people were subjected to, the logistics, moving drugs from central medical stores and so on and so forth. At the facility level, seeing to it that drug levels are at, monitoring drug levels so that patients don't experience stockouts, even if the drugs are there at the central facility, but they are not there at the local facility because of mismanagement of the supply chain. And at the individual level, the side effects of the drugs themselves, and maybe treatment fatigue, and yeah.
Great. So I think a couple of things. Number one is, like, as you're talking about this, you're sort of constructing a logic model of the problem, right? Like what you've said is that first of all, it's multi-level. and then COVID was part of it. Maybe disruptions to the regular health systems because of COVID was a part of it. But maybe COVID disrupted the supply chain for hypertensives. I'm not sure. Maybe that's part of what you were getting at. But at any rate, you have, like, even by talking about it, you have a kind of sort of, you have a logic model of the problem. You have some understanding of like where the problem comes from, what its components are, that it's multifaceted, right? And that it's multi-level. There's multiple socioecological levels at play, and you're sort of starting to develop a nuanced understanding of the problem. Now to go back to the beginning of this, in some sense, like what do you think has been said about this problem in sort of in sort of scientific discourse? That might be a little bit of a tricky question to answer, but like, can you compare and contrast what you think you've read about this versus what you just said, and where are the like fissures?
Yeah. Well, this is quite tricky, but the literature does talk to the side effects, male patients, for instance, would complain of impotence, and you start giving them drugs, and you control the blood pressure, but then they find that they are sexually dysfunctional, and then they start taking the drugs maybe irregularly, and the supply chain of the drugs also has been talked about. Drugs being reaching their expiry dates at a central pharmaceutical storage facility, and yet the peripheral facilities do not have the drug. And what has been said also about concerns the poverty of nations to have enough supplies of drugs, and the cost of drugs, and so on and so forth. Roughly, this is
No, this is okay. So this is great. I lingered a little bit on this. Even I think unfortunately I've taken up the time that I've been given. But Vincent, so that was great, right? I heard you think out loud about a logic model of the problem, and then what you think has been said. Like I'm just going to sort of interpret, I think, and add to a little bit of what you said to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make here about constructing the argument. What I heard from you is something along the lines of, like, it would be something along the lines of like the problems with incorporating hypertension treatment into HIV programs are multifaceted, and many of them live at the sort of facility level, which is an area of, I'm going to paraphrase because I'm not sure this is exactly what you said, but which is an area that has been understudied or neglected because too much attention has gone to either the micro or the macro issues on either side, right? So, like, yes, there are studies about like side effects and beta blockers and perhaps sexual dysfunction and things like that, but those side effects might be taking up. Your argument could be that they don't explain like the vast underuse of antihypertensives. On the other hand, you said that like there are some studies looking at supply chain issues and sort of availability at the national level of essential medications, but that isn't necessarily the case in countries like Botswana, where you do have access to those medications, right? So this isn't particularly well constructed because it's on the fly, but the idea is that like You're taking what you think is going on, and then you're taking what people have said is going on, and you're looking for like a gap or a dissonance or a space between those. And that's where you're going to create your problem statement and then try to like add to it in your scientific proposal. So let me wrap up. I think it's 10:02. I think I've exceeded my time, but I think that the last thing I'll just say is that sort of the sort of theories and frameworks can help people do that. It doesn't supplement your own input into a diagnosis, but can be helpful. Let me wrap up and hand it over to my colleague.
Thank you so much, Elvin. Great presentation. Thank you, Vincent, for your case. And we're heading now to the next presentation by Dr. Angela Brown. If you want to go ahead and put those slides together, Manny. And also, I want to let the group know that Manny will be moderating the last few sessions of the morning before the end of the session. So, Manny, go ahead. And Angela, are you on the call?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Perfectly. Thank you, Angela. And please take it away, role of community engagement in implementation science research. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you very much. And good morning to those who are on a morning time. And I think most people are probably on afternoon, and I'm very early morning. So thanks a lot. So I just want to take a few moments to just give a brief overview of the role of community engagement in implementation science research. And we just had a nice brief discussion from Elvin about the grant writing process in this. But one of the things to consider in all of your grants, no matter what you're doing, is that the importance of community engagement. And if we just take a look here, the Institute of Medicine is a group here in the United States that I think they actually said it best when they said that to improve human health requires meaningful community engagement across the entire spectrum of research. So no matter if you're doing basic science to community and population health research, that community engagement is considered essential, especially for effectively translating the research into practice and increasingly recognizing it as a key to a successful clinical trial recruitment, that you have to have that community input that's there. And if we look at a basic definition of community engaged research, and this is from our own, next slide. This is from our own Centers for Disease Control, that defines community engaged research as the process of working collaboratively with or through groups of people, whether they're affiliated by geographic proximity, special interests, it's in this case, HIV or cardiovascular disease. So no matter what that special interest is, or there may be other similar situations, but the key is that it's respect to issues that are affecting people's well-being. So how do you get groups of people to work collaboratively with researchers to address these issues? And I think the simple way to put it is, from a community's perspective, don't design something for me without me. Or as I heard someone else say, don't come into my kitchen and try to tell me how to cook. When we do research, we're trying to, better the community, whatever the topic is, whatever the identified problem. So the people that are being affected should be involved in that process of having some say-so about what's going on. They should know what's being studied that should hopefully be of benefit for them. Next slide. And that's where we get to the implementation science piece. And then here I just kind of have a basic definition from the NIH. It says it's the scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practice into routine practice, and hence to improve the quality and effectiveness of health services. But again, making sure that those who are affected are not only aware of what's going on, aware of those research findings, but that they benefit from the findings. So often we do research and we get the results and policy is generated, or we get the results and papers are written, but the people who have been a part of the project, who have supported the project, and who are going to benefit from the project never know what was really done, what their contributions were, and they never know the end result until it's way down the road. So we have to make sure that they are not only aware of what's going on, but they benefit from the findings. Next slide. So community engaged research really does encompass all of the aspects of research. And this is from where you have to really consider this from your development process. So, one of the things that we talk to investigators about is when you first start thinking about your project, you need to start thinking about the community engaged aspect for it. And so, the rationale behind this is that this collaborative engagement really is from the beginning. And think about the communities that you're bringing together to understand what they can uniquely add to the project. So, if you're thinking about the research agenda, when you have that community voice, sometimes it will change the focus of the project and may enhance your ability for obtaining funding. These groups have lived experience, they have, aspects that we don't understand. I mean, we have a theory about something, but when you go to the folks who are most affected, they can add information that can be very beneficial. Those conversations can lead to, for example, to improvements in the study design, in the recruitment methods. So often we see clinical trials that have been designed, that have been funded, get to the recruitment stage, and no one wants to participate in the study. So then the researcher goes back and says, why is no one wanting to sign up for this? And when you ask the community members, they're like, no one's going to do this. And they tell you why. If those conversations have been had early, then those pitfalls can be addressed. So having them as part of the process. Similarly, identifying ethical pitfalls. We may not think about some of these things, but when you take it to the community partners, some of those ethical issues may come up. And then, at the very end, the implementation process, the implementation of the promising findings. When they're involved in that aspect, you get better receptivity to the research, and there's greater potential for the community to reap the benefits of the research as well. So bottom line, community engaged research, it's relevant to all researchers, no matter what stage, and it's never too late to engage folks in that process if you've already started. Next next slide. And one of the key things that I want to say here, if there's one important thing to take away from today, is that this is more than just a one-time checkbox. It really is a process. It's about relationship building that's based on trust. So once you start this process, it has to continue throughout. And when you just kind of check that box and say, yeah, I talked to a couple of community folks, that really doesn't fly. Those conversations, that community engagement, that collaboration has to be a part of every step of your research process. Next slide. So how do we go about doing this? And as I said, it's not just a one check box, but it really is, three key steps. And the first step is you need to know who you want to engage. You have to identify who those community partners are, whether it's a person or a group. It may be a local group, a national group, a community leader, or a combination, all of the above. It may be other universities that you're in partnership with, but that's really the key first step, is identifying who it is that you need to have at the table. And then step number 2 and 3 are about how you go about this approach and then maintaining that relationship. Next slide. So, just in the interest of time, I won't open the mic up, but what I want you to think about is, who are your stakeholders, okay? And who is a key stakeholder? Well, that's a person, group, organization that may have an interest in your research or are affected by its outcome. So again, we're talking about a broad spectrum here, or it could be the intended end user of your research results. So for each of your projects, as you're getting started, as you're developing, it's sort of a question is, who am I doing this for? And who needs to be at the table? Who are my stakeholders? So this includes academic institutions, patients, their caregivers, advocacy groups. It could be the providers themselves. It could be a hospital health system. It also includes other health research foundations, industry, community-based organizations. I mean, I'm just listing, and this just shows you how broad it could be. The religious community, schools, and then the government. Governmental and non-governmental organizations are all potential stakeholders. So you have to decide who needs to be at the table. And then once you have that laid out, then you kind of prioritize the top one to three that are really key for you to engage with. Next slide. And meaningful engagement is about relationship building. It's, like any other kind of relationship you're in, whether it's a friendship or a working relationship, it has to be nurtured. It's not just a simple transaction, because these relationships really do take time. It requires respect for all of the stakeholders. You're asking them for your opinion, for their opinion. So you have to respect that opinion. And again, it's about listening and about developing that trust. So it's just like any other relationship that you're trying to build. Next slide. And then the third phase is committing for the long haul. And this gets us to the 5 core principles of community engagement. In that commitment for the long haul, what strategies should you think about as we go through this process? So I just kind of want to review very quickly those 5 core principles. And the first principle, as I've already discussed, is understanding and knowing who your stakeholders are. So it's that definition and scope of community engagement and research, but it's really about understanding the stakeholders. The key questions: who is your community? What are the project goals? And is this study designed to result in a positive social change for that community? And then why should your research matter to your stakeholders when you're doing this? Does this matter to them, and why should it matter to them? Next slide. Principle number 2, you have to get to know your stakeholder. You have to listen. It's a process, so you can't rush it. So these partnerships are truly based on a mutual understanding of your partner's needs, their capacity, and their goals as well. So this is something that can't be rushed. Next slide. Equitable power and responsibility. This is about not underestimating the value of lived expertise. Diversity of populations and stakeholders and perspectives is very strongly encouraged. But again, you want that partner engaged in all aspects of the research process, recognizing that some folks will be at different stages than other, but having those conversations about responsibility, who's responsible for what, accountability for each aspect of the project, and willing to share the power in this. So this is really where that, the value of listening and respect becomes very important. Next slide. Principle number 4 is about capacity building. Understanding that partnering will make both groups better, not only the researcher, but the community stakeholder, particularly when it's a community-based organization. As a researcher, you will increase your own capacity to conduct the research. You'll have better data. You'll obtain assistance in recruiting and retaining research participants, but the partners will gain from this as well. It's important to share the resources with them, and as needed, share the funding and make sure that they have what they need in order to be a good partner with you. And that's the capacity building piece. There may be some gaps that they have that you can help them fill in order to build their capacity to be a good partner with you so that you can move the research forward. And next slide. And finally, core principle number 5, and again, this is very important for the sustainability piece, is that's an effective dissemination of the plan and effective dissemination of the end results at the end. But you want to make an impact. You want to sustain this partnership, and that requires, bidirectional, continuous communication to keep the stakeholders engaged. And at the end, you want to make sure that you can translate the findings into either policies or programs that's based on the research projects, the goals that you've agreed upon, and that's the dissemination piece. So again, you're walking me through this whole process from the very beginning when you're conceptualizing your research project. You want to identify your stakeholders. You want to have them at the table. You want to make sure that what you're thinking about makes sense to the people that will be effective. You want to keep them engaged, have them as an active part of the process. That means sharing resources with them as necessary. And then as you get towards the end, you want to make sure that they're involved in the final product as well. So finally, last slide, this is just a link to a resource. This is community engagement and research, the frameworks for education and peer review. And this actually goes through the core principles. There's actually a couple more. This is just kind of the brief summary. But this is a much more detailed document that talks about community engagement. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for that amazing presentation. In the interest of time, we won't take any oral questions. Please put your questions in the chat box. We would want to move on to Dr. Rice, to talk about the small research projects, which I know a lot of you have interest in. And after that, we'll have a moment for Q&A, question and answer. So thank you all for holding on. Thanks. Steve, over to you.
All right, can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to talk about is the Small Research Project. We abbreviate that SRP. And I know there's been quite a few questions come up, and hopefully I will address some of them for you now. So, if, the countdown is not working. Okay. Everything that I'm going to be talking about for the next few minutes is addressed in these two documents. If you have not received them yet, you will shortly. There's a form with instructions for completing the SRP application.
The reporting form.
I'm sorry. Was that a question? Okay. there's 3 documents. The second one is a protocol document for the SRP, and the third one is a protocol document for the mock study section. So anyway, if you have not received these documents yet, you will shortly. Okay. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the background, and you've heard most of this already. First, what is this? It's a funding source for trainees and entry-level investigators who are participating in the 6 sub-Saharan African countries that are part of our project. The aim of the SRP is to facilitate transition for each of these entry-level investigators from early stage to independent investigators. So we want to help facilitate your transition, and we will do this by providing a small monetary support for a research project, provide you with the opportunity to learn some critical grant writing skills, and also an opportunity to generate pilot data in support of hopefully a subsequent application or grant application that you will write and do. The next thing is project examples. So there has been a question about this. Basically, the instructions say it's something very brief. Your project should focus on a topic that's relevant to populations in lower and middle income countries, and or relevant methodologies to that. There is one caveat: you cannot do an independent clinical trial, although you can do secondary data analysis of an ongoing clinical trial, such as the project that is part of the Alliance, the HLB Central Alliance. You can also look at ancillary studies for a currently funded project. You can also focus on supporting translational and uptake of effective interventions to prevent and or mitigate the impact of heart, lung, blood, and sleep comorbid conditions in people living with HIV in these lower and middle income countries. And so the topics that Elvin and Angela were just talking about related to community engagement, as well as the D&I methodology related to community engagement, would be crucial topics for you. Who is eligible? Basically, any of the entry-level investigators, such as trainees and or junior investigators that are affiliated with one of the 6 Alliance research projects. And you don't have to be based in one of the sub-Saharan African countries in order to qualify. If you're an early-stage investigator in one of the U.S. affiliated groups with these research projects, you would also be eligible. You would also want to bring on board with you mentors from among the Alliance research project investigators, or investigators from other non-Alliance or aligned researchers who have expertise in the relevant fields related to this project. And then together with your mentors, you will work to develop a suitable project and do a write-up. So the applicant will complete an NIH-style write-up that is a grant application, and you will, of course, use the advice and assistance as needed from your mentors, from the other investigators at your group, and other consultants as needed. For example, maybe you need a statistical consultant. Also, in addition to this application, you will have the opportunity to write a draft of it first, have it reviewed by members of the Alliance in a mock study section. So you can first submit your draft to this mock study, get feedback. You will then have an opportunity to revise your application and then submit it finally for the small research project application. So the application process itself, the components are modeled after and in fact are a subset of the NIH award. And I know Lisa and a couple of others this morning talked a bit about the components of an NIH award. So the investigators, the environment, etc. So those things will be important to discuss in your application for the SRP. Your application will be submitted to a peer survey, which is curated by the Red Cap Peer RC Research Coordinating Center. The main application itself will consist of several components that you see here. And again, all of this is outlined in those three documents I showed you earlier at the top of this top. There's a main application, which should be about 6 pages, with the title, significance, approach, etc. You should have a bibliography. There should be a budget and justification. You need bio sketches for yourself and for your mentors and the other co-investigators in your project. You should list your career goals. You need a letter from your mentor and mentors. And then there will be additional pages that should be included in your application as well, such as a research purpose statement, a clinical trial statement, that is stating that this is not a clinical trial. And also there will be certain responsible conduct of research, human subjects, animal training, animal protection training that you will need to consider as well. So basically all the components that you would need for an NIH Psych Award, you will need to satisfy here for the SRP. Funding decisions will be made by peer review. And basically, we will consider funding up to 6 applications every year, annually for 2 to 4 years, depending on the length of the study. And the maximum amount of the award that you can request is $5,000. This is an overview of the actual process. It's a diagram in one of the documents that you will receive. Let me just look at the top half first. Basically, on the left-hand side, we see the process of the mock review session, and on the right side is the actual SRP submission. So, as shown here, the SRP application you can draft with help from your team. You will submit the draft either to the mock study section on the left or to the SRP application itself on the right. Hopefully you will submit to a mock study first, get feedback, be able to improve your application, and then switch over and submit to the SRP application itself. After you submit either of these applications at the RCC, the Research Coordinating Center, we will check it for completeness and for eligibility, and we may ask you to revise certain components and resubmit to us again. So if there's a deadline, you need to be able to submit this so that if there are any revisions that we request, that you're able to make those revisions and resubmit in time for the final deadline. Okay. So the next step, if this is a mock study, the application will go to the reviewers. The mock study section will take place. This is usually via a Zoom meeting, and you will be able to hear the discussion of the reviewers about your application. You'll be able to then revise and then submit for the actual SRP application. This is on the right. You see there's several steps here. The federal team will review the application. There will also be the scientific review panel of the Alliance peers, the capacity building subcommittee, of which Conejo and Samantha are the leaders, along with Victor Avila. Will review the scientific reviews and the federal administrative review. They will make funding decisions. The reviews will then also be sent to the applicant, and then A decision will be made whether you're funded or not funded. If you're not funded, you will have an opportunity to revise and resubmit again in the next SSLP funding cycle. So that's the basic process. There will be some oversight and deliverables. For example, one of the things that you need to have in your application is a timetable. So, for example, you will need to write usually by quarters, like kind of a timeline, associated tasks or goals or deliverables. And then you may be asked to also develop a contingency plan in case of delays due to unforeseen circumstances. For example, if COVID is the one thing that has delayed projects. You will also be asked to report at certain intervals on your progress. And you will also be asked at some point at the next annual meeting to present on progress about your SRP project as well as your funding. And here are some general deadlines. I think Victor reviewed these already. The grant writing workshop is being held now. The mock study sections will be held at the end of June, the 1st of July. The SRP submission date, the final submission date is the 29th of July. The review committee will be meeting in early to mid-August. Approval funding announcements will be made in September, 4th of September. And then you will probably be asked to report on your progress at the annual meeting in October. Here are some more of the more specific deadlines. So, for example, the first deadline that's coming up is if you're going to submit your SRP for a mock study, the deadline for that submission will be the 17th of June. Mock study section itself will take place from the 7th to the 30th of June, times to be decided, etc. So there's several more dates listed here through the review deadline, when the capacity building committee needs to discuss funding issues, etc. So you will receive a copy of this presentation, which will have this information on it. Okay, so that's pretty much everything that I wanted to discuss with regard to the SRP. I'm willing to take comments now. If there's any discussion, I know there were some questions previously. I hope I answered them, but if not, please bring them up again. So I think this is an open discussion. Are there any questions?
Yes, thank you, Trevor, for that wonderful presentation. So this is the time for you to come to us with any questions you may have regarding any of the presentations you had today, either on implementation science methods, community engagement, writing a specific aim, or the SRP components. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat box or raise your hand and unmute yourself. Please don't be shy. We're very charismatic bunch over here, so please feel free.
Well, it looks like we've done such a wonderful job of presenting everything. No one has any questions. Could that be true? Yes.
Yes.
Emmanuel. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I probably didn't catch everything, but I'm sure I caught a few things. So just wanted to find out if there is any cap. Am I being heard, first of all?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Okay, but you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I was saying that I don't know if there's any cap in the duration that a small research would take. I don't know if you
Oh, okay.
mentioned. Yeah.
Okay, a cap in the research. In other words, in length of time. It should be completed within a 12-month cycle. Okay,
Okay.
so right, so you part of your grant application, you will provide a timeline. So these are short, these are very small, only 5K. So there's not a lot of money there, and there's also not a lot of time. And in your timeline, you should specify from beginning to end with the deliverable specified by the last quarter of your 12-month duration. That might be a grant that you're going to submit, or a publication you're going to submit, write and submit. Basically, this is to provide some pilot data for you to consider a more in-depth long-term project.
Okay, that's fine. Just then one more. Then
Okay.
the opportunity to speak. So I get the feeling that the research grant persons in academic institutions are sort of favored because I heard part of the presentation saying the institution where you are from, that is specifically universities and probably research institutions. So is it a minus for persons who are interested in research who are not necessarily situated in an academic institution?
Okay, so the answer to that is no, not necessarily. Wherever you are, your institution or company or whatever group you're with should be able to submit NIH-style grants. Okay, so that could be pharma, or it could be other types of institutions, and not necessarily academic. You should, however, be associated with and a junior faculty associated with one of the 6 funded research projects in the Alliance. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's perfect. So that association, as long as it's established, is good enough.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for those questions. That was good. Any others? For me or for anyone else that gave presentations today?
We had a question in the chat box from Akilio Kilimba. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrongly. About if there is an opportunity to submit their SLP next year if they don't meet the eligibility period for this year. And the simple answer is yes. And so for the next 3-4 years, we would have these SRP opportunities yearly. And so even if you submit this year and for some reason your application is not selected, you can apply again next year. So.
Claudia also asked a question. Thank you, Manny. Our degree requirements, are there any degree requirements for the SRP applicants? And I would say no, although you would need to be able to submit, be qualified to submit a grant to NIH. We have had, I do believe that NIH will accept applications for people with master's degrees rather than a terminal doctorate of some type. That's my guess. I'm not sure if that's the actual correct answer or not. Is anyone on from NIH call today? I don't really see anybody from NIH. Victor, do you know the answer to that? Are you still on the line? So Claudia, we will check that question in more detail and let you know if what I said is correct. Okay, also the applicants, can they know who the reviewers will be? So at this point, the reviewers will be one of the, well, up to three of the Alliance investigators, so senior level investigators typically. So we try to not have someone review your application from your site. So if you're from, say, Nigeria, we try not to have someone from Nigeria review your grant application. But other than that, the reviewers will be members of the Alliance. And we don't know who will be those reviewers yet. It's a volunteer basis. You will know who your reviewers are at some point, but maybe not ahead of time. So Winnie Sarah asked if the applications were all in LMIC countries. And I did not see any specification that had to be from one of the 6 countries. So far, all of the FSP applications have been from one of the 6 alliance countries, but the regulations themselves state that it has to be from an LMIC country, so it's not specified. Is a list of the successful projects available? Yes. They are available. I don't think we have them published publicly at this point in time, but we can supply that information for you. Additional questions? These are all great questions. Thank you. I encourage everyone, at the early stage investigator level to apply for this. It's $5,000 to help you get some pilot data. And if you do have low publication rate at this point in time, this could lead to one or more publications for you for a future application. So it's a great opportunity.
And I also want to add that, even beyond this $5,000 funding, this is a really good opportunity to have a research question you're thinking about get polished, because some of the reviewers from this alliance are seasoned scientists and researchers, and having them brood and ruminate over your questions and try to give you ideas for how to improve your questions. It's a way to to really get kind of real-time feedback on some of the research questions you may have. Taiwo, I see your hand raised, and so please go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this workshop. Please, I need a clarification. I want to know the small research studies must it be centered around people living with HIV, or could it be any other area of research? I would like a clarification on that.
I apologize. I did not catch your question. Manny, did you catch the question?
My question is the small research grant project. I would like to clarify the research study. Must it be centered around people living with HIV, or could it be research from other field of medicine or any other field?
So if I hear you correctly, you're asking if the topic of the research project has to be around HIV and or hypertension?
Yes.
Okay. Not necessarily. It needs to be an issue that is relevant in lower and middle income countries. I think higher there may be some preference given for those related to HIV and/or hypertension, but I don't think that it is required that it be related to that specifically. If you're thinking about writing a presentation for NHLBI, these would be topics that would be most relevant for the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute.
Okay. Thank you.
So, right. So I think the short answer is not necessarily, but it probably would be a good idea to try to keep it in that area if possible.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, another question. Any eligibility criteria for the selection of mentors? Region, country, number of mentors allowed, etc. No. Although I think it would be a great idea to have one of the investigators or co-investigators from your group, whichever group you're from, project you're from, be on your committee as one of your mentors. But certainly, if there's expertise that you can gain from outside of the alliance, you should be able to bring them on as well. They would, as with all of your mentors, would want to fill out a bio sketch, as part of your application as well.
Just going back to Tyrell's question,
Yes.
I think that we welcome and encourage, creative ideas and topics that are not probably traditional to what everyone is thinking about. And so it could be related to the impact of COVID on how things are working in clinics and community participation in research. And so we really encourage you to challenge your thinking and come up with innovative questions, with a caveat that collecting data will be possible from the population that you are working with. And so it has to be something that is sort of asked for.
And remember, no clinical trial. You can use data from an existing clinical trial, but you cannot propose to do a clinical trial for the SLP. Thank you, Manny, for that clarification. Any other questions? We still have about 8 more minutes to go. There is some homework. Manny, did you want to talk about any of the homework? If there's no more questions about the SLP or any other of the talks that were presented today?
Yes, certainly, I can do that. And so tomorrow we'll be diving deeper into career development, IDP backgrounds, and methods sections of grant proposal. And we would really encourage you to read the two grant examples that were sent to you when you registered. I will resend those articles again with the slides from today. And so you come prepared for our next session on Thursday with questions regarding some of the things you saw in the methods section of specific aims or other aspects of those proposals that we would send to you. And that is all for the homework for
Manny, will you be also circulating the 2 documents that I referred to for the SLP?
Yes, we'll circulate that as well. And so we will just allow 2 more minutes for an open forum if there are any other questions. Okay, I see Zaira. Please go ahead.
Hi to everyone. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I have a question. I've recently started in the grant world and in the research world. So I kind of don't understand why what's the use for the grants? Because when you're a bachelor student, sorry, you don't ask for financing to any other to the initiation or any institution. You do your research by your own financing. So I'm so sorry if I'm not describing it very well, but I have my doubt is when you're applying for a grant, what this grant should be covered in the research. I mean, it covers your invest of time. It covers your
Right. So some of the things, so this is 5K, $5,000, so it's not very much to begin with, but it might cover the cost of copying, it might cover the cost of mailing to send out surveys, it might cover part of your salary. So there's any number of things that it might cover. It might cover the cost of going to a meeting and presenting your results at a conference. It might cover publication costs to publish some of your results. You know, publication is not always free. You know, there's any number of things that the money could be used for, and would be.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I hope that answered your question.
Karen, that's a very good question. And on Friday, for day 3 of our session, we will have an expert talk to us about the budget component of a grant proposal. And so what goes into budgeting, how much the researchers are paid, how much goes into overhead costs and other things like that. And so I would really encourage you to stay tuned and ask more questions on day 3. But thank you so much for your question.
So Monica asked for proposals based on secondary analysis. Does the data have to be only from projects conducted under the Alliance project for the HLB simple? And the answer is no. You can use data from secondary data from pretty much any source. NIH has lots of data available. I'm sure some of the countries that we're from also have publicly available databases that would address the question of interest that you are proposing. Okay, thank you. All right, so we've got about 1 minute, Manny. Reminder to please complete the